If you're so smart, then explain it. That's what Dr. Stephen Howbridge snapped at Nurse Cassandra Dorsey right before everything began to unravel. In a world where titles often speak louder than truth, what happens when the person without the power ends up being the only one who can see what's coming? Why did a respected surgeon freeze in silence, and what did one black nurse uncover that no one else dared to say out loud? This isn't just a hospital story. It's a battle between ego and experience, silence and justice. Stick around, because what happened next shook an entire institution. Dear viewer, if you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you write the location from where you are watching right now, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss the notifications of my daily published news stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. The fluorescent lights in the east wing of Wexley Memorial Hospital hummed softly overhead, a sterile symphony that was all too familiar to Nurse Cassandra "Cassie" Dorsey. At 44, she'd seen more inside these walls than most of the residents fresh out of med school had seen in their entire lives. Years of experience, leadership under pressure, intuition sharpened like a scalpel, none of it, however, made her immune to the sting of disrespect that seemed to cling to her like static in this institution. Dr. Stephen Howbridge strode into the wing like he owned it. In a way, he did. At 51, with a portfolio full of published research and a reputation for brilliance coated in ice, Howbridge had just been appointed as chief of surgery. Tall, square-jawed, and impeccably dressed in a tailored white coat stitched with his initials, he radiated the kind of privilege that made people straighten their backs and swallow their truths. Cassie didn't flinch when he entered the nurse's station, but she did steel herself. "Nurse Dorsey," he said without looking up from his tablet, his voice clipped. "I'm going to need you on the Huntley prep in 30 minutes. And if you're going to make a habit of leaving notes that read like riddles, at least have the decency to explain yourself properly. This, medication timing adjusted due to renal pattern note? What renal pattern? If you're so smart, then explain it." The words slid out of his mouth like poison syrup. Several eyes shifted toward Cassie, waiting for a reaction. Cassie took a breath, deep and even. "Dr. Howbridge, the patient's BUN and creatinine levels have spiked over the past 2 days. At 73, and with a long-standing history of hypertension, the risk of nephrotoxicity from his current antibiotic schedule is elevated. I adjusted the administration times to match his metabolic window based on his latest labs you haven't reviewed yet, I'm guessing." Howbridge paused, eyes narrowing. "That's quite a theory, nurse. But adjustments like that should come from a physician, not someone playing scientist." There it was. The dismissal. The implication. Cassie had long since learned not to let it show, but today it hit with a little more heat. "With respect, doctor, the patient is stable." That wasn't theory. It was practice. He waved a hand dismissively. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Just prep Huntley. Leave the real decisions to the ones with the degrees." She turned without another word, her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Inside or 3, the tension followed like a shadow. Huntley, the patient, had a complicated file, a tumor resection combined with multiple comorbidities. The surgical team moved in harmony, until Howbridge called out a dosage instruction that made Cassie stiffen. "Doctor, with his potassium at 6.3, that dosage might push him into arrhythmia." Howbridge scoffed. "Nurse Dorsey, you seem to have an opinion on every move I make today. You're here to assist, not lead. Administer the dose." She hesitated, and the anesthesiologist looked up, concern flickering. Cassie's eyes met his. "Dr. Flynn, I advise against it." Howbridge stepped forward, furious now. "If you can't follow direct orders, I will have you removed." "Then do it," Cassie said, voice like stone. "But I won't endanger a patient for your ego." The room froze. Even the surgical tech stopped moving. "Dr. Flynn, check his ECG and potassium again," she said. Howbridge didn't stop her this time. The monitor beeped a warning just as Lynn confirmed it. Cassie had been right. The surgery proceeded, but the air was thick. Halbridge didn't speak to her again, not even a thank you. Later, in the break room, whispers floated. She stood up to Halbridge. Save the guy. Cassie just sipped her tea, hands steady. She'd done what she always did, fought to be heard. But something in Halbridge's silence told her this wasn't over. He wouldn't take public correction lightly. She was right. The next day, she arrived to find her schedule slashed, and her access to patient charts restricted, pending review. No explanation, no discussion. Just bureaucracy used like a blade. Cassie stared at the screen, lips tight. They thought this would silence her. But they had no idea what was coming. Cassie walked the hallways of Wexley Memorial like a ghost. Staff greeted her with uncertain nods now, some out of solidarity, others out of fear. Whatever whisper campaign Halbridge had begun was already blooming like mold in a damp room. When she entered the admin office that morning to question the schedule change, she was met not with answers, but cold avoidance. The charge nurse, Trina Foster, a former ally, avoided eye contact and muttered something about orders from higher up. Cassie didn't need a memo to know what was happening. Halbridge was making it clear: disagree with him, challenge his authority, and you'd be erased slowly, bureaucratically, with plausible deniability. But Cassie had learned long ago that silence was complicity. She wouldn't be erased. That afternoon, she spotted Halbridge at the nurse's station reviewing charts, surrounded by 3 younger residents who hung on his every word. They chuckled at some private joke just as she approached. "Dear Halbridge, I need to speak to you about the access restrictions placed on my account." He turned slowly, the smirk already dancing on his lips. "Ah, Nurse Dorsey. I was wondering when you'd come to plead your case." "I'm not here to plead. I need full access reinstated. I'm part of the primary care team on 3 patients whose post-op notes I can't even view." He clicked his pen with exaggerated patience. "It's a temporary review. You'll be back at full function once we confirm your notes align with best practices." "And who's deciding that?" she asked. "Internal Review Board. Medical leadership." She knew that meant him and his cronies. "You're punishing me for speaking up during surgery." He tilted his head in mock curiosity. "Punishment? You think this is about revenge?" "No, nurse. This is about ensuring proper protocol. You overstepped." Cassie's voice dropped an octave. "And if I hadn't, Mr. Huntley might have coded on that table. Or he might have been just fine," Halbridge said smoothly. "We'll never know, because you interrupted a trained surgeon mid-operation. This isn't a debate hall." One of the residents laughed quietly, then stifled it when Cassie turned her gaze on him. She didn't raise her voice. "You don't want people like me thinking. Just obeying." Halbridge didn't deny it. "You said it, not me." She left before her fury boiled over, but that evening she began building her case. Pulling files. Talking to staff. Creating a timeline. Not for HR, she'd seen too many cases buried in paperwork, but for something bigger. Because Halbridge didn't just dismiss her. He endangered patients. And she wasn't the only one who'd seen it. Down in records, a young med tech named Amina handed her a copy of a prior chart from a different surgery Halbridge had rushed. "I shouldn't be doing this. But you're not wrong. He steamrolls people." Cassie nodded, grateful. "You're doing the right thing." She went home that night with a folder full of fire and a resolve like armor. They wanted to test her limits. They were about to learn she didn't break. She sharpened her mind like a blade. And the knife was headed for the clipboard of Dr. Halbridge. Cassie's living room transformed into a command center over the next week. Stacks of printed case notes covered her coffee table, yellow legal pads scribbled with timelines, charts cross-referencing lab results, prescriptions, and procedural records. Each highlighter stroke wasn't just about proving herself right, it was about proving that patients were being put at risk by a man so convinced of his own infallibility, he dismissed facts as insolence when they came from the wrong mouth. Cassie hadn't climbed through decades of institutional barriers just to be reduced to a rebellious nurse with an attitude. No, her resume, meticulously updated and tucked neatly in her manila file, spoke volumes: bachelor's in nursing with honors, master's in clinical pathophysiology, certifications in critical care and pharmacokinetics, 21 years of bedside care, 8 years as a lead nurse educator, and more peer-reviewed articles than some of the doctors she reported to. But none of that mattered to Halbridge. To him, she was a nurse. And worse, a black one with opinions. On Wednesday, she arrived at Wexley Memorial 15 minutes early, not to clock in, but to quietly observe. She lingered near the observation window 2 or 6, where Halbridge was consulting with a young second-year resident, Jonah Patel. Through the glass, she could hear pieces of the exchange. "Did you consider tapering the vasoactive agent first?" Jonah asked. Halbridge scoffed. "That's textbook thinking. I make real-world decisions." Jonah shrank a little, nodding. Cassie narrowed her eyes. This wasn't mentoring. This was indoctrination. Later that day, in the nurse's lounge, she found Jonah alone, hunched over a tablet. "Dr. Patel," she said gently. "Mind if I speak with you?" He looked up, startled. "Oh, Nurse Dorsey, of course. Did I do something wrong earlier?" "Not at all," she said. "But I saw how he spoke to you. You questioned something because you saw a safer approach. That's what good medicine is. Don't let anyone train that out of you." Jonah sighed. "It's hard. He's intimidating. He's dangerous when no one speaks up," she replied. "Do you remember the Taylor case last month? Renal failure post-op?" Jonah nodded. He insisted on pushing fluids aggressively. Ignored the nephrology consult. Cassie lowered her voice. "Do you have access to those pre- and post-op labs? I'm building a timeline. You wouldn't have to testify. Just data." He hesitated. "Isn't this kind of risky?" She looked him square in the eye. "So is letting him keep playing God." That evening, he sent her the lab files encrypted and anonymous. She added them to her case folder, now nearly an inch thick. By Friday, she had 5 separate case inconsistencies, all showing Halbridge dismissing staff recommendations, ignoring lab values, or overriding consults. She knew it still wouldn't be enough to take him down inside the hospital. Wexley protected its own, especially those who brought in research dollars and status. So she made a plan. Cassie scheduled a presentation at the upcoming Interdepartmental Quality Assurance meeting. Officially, her topic was multidisciplinary approaches to patient risk reduction. Unofficially, it was her moment. The day of the meeting, she walked in with her folder tucked under her arm and her head held high. Doctors, nurses, department heads, administrators, all gathered in the small auditorium. Halbridge sat near the front, legs crossed, glancing at his phone like none of it concerned him. She opened with a case study, anonymized, of course, describing a patient who had barely escaped renal failure due to a miscalculated medication protocol. She didn't name names. Not yet. But as she layered in the data, referencing lab timelines, medication charts, and ignored consultation notes, the atmosphere shifted. People started leaning forward. Some scribbled notes. Halbridge had put down his phone. Then came the final slide: when expertise is ignored, the cost of hierarchical erosion in critical care. She met Halbridge's eyes. The pattern is clear. Decisions are being made not from collaboration, but from ego. Ignoring team input isn't just inefficient. It's dangerous. Whispers filled the room. Someone murmured, "Is she talking about?" Halbridge stood up suddenly. "This is slanderous. You're presenting incomplete, cherry-picked data. You're a nurse, not a clinician. You're overstepping again." Cassie didn't blink. Then explain it, she said, calm and deliberate. If you're so smart, then explain it. Why override nephrology twice? Why administer potassium-increasing agents to a hyperkalemic patient? Why were multiple staff concerns logged but never addressed? He opened his mouth. Closed it. For the first time in that room, Dr. Stephen Halbridge had no answer. Silence blanketed the auditorium. The moderator cleared her throat. We'll take a 15-minute recess. Cassie stepped down from the podium slowly, deliberately. She passed Halbridge as she exited. He didn't meet her eyes. Because he couldn't. He had just been schooled by the very voice he tried to silence. And now the whole hospital had heard it. The tension after the presentation didn't dissolve with the 15-minute recess, it thickened. The corridors of Wexley Memorial buzzed with restrained energy, like static before a storm. People spoke in hushed tones around corners, side-eyed through open office doors, and exchanged silent nods with those they used to overlook. Cassie returned to the East Wing nursing station with her usual stride, head high, but she felt the change instantly. Monica, a fellow RN who rarely made eye contact, offered her a genuine, quiet, good job in there. A young intern gave her a respectful nod, and even Trina, the charge nurse who'd ghosted her earlier, managed an awkward smile. But the most telling response came from absence. Dr. Halbridge hadn't been seen in the ICU since the presentation. His name was still on the board for a noon consultation, but he never showed. Word spread fast, he had retreated to his office after the meeting and hadn't emerged. No lunch. No or rounds. No retaliation, yet. Cassie knew better than to think silence meant surrender. The next day, she arrived early to find her computer login reactivated. Full access. No email, no apology, just restored privileges, as if nothing had happened. She sat down, logged in, and began reviewing her patient's overnight notes like it was any other day. But each keystroke echoed louder than before. She wasn't invisible anymore. And that scared people. At noon, she was paged to a meeting with HR and medical administration. The moment she saw the email subject line, ***, clarification regarding departmental presentation content ***, her jaw tightened. There it was. The rebuttal. The retaliation is masked in bureaucracy. In the small conference room, Dr. Vanessa Hale from Internal Affairs sat beside a woman Cassie recognized only vaguely from HR. There was a third chair, conspicuously empty. Halbridge's. Dr. Hale began, her tone neutral. Nurse Dorsey, thank you for coming. We're conducting a formal inquiry into yesterday's QA presentation. We need to discuss the sources of your data and the intentions behind your topic. My sources are patient records, publicly accessible consult logs, and internal medication charts, Cassie said, voice steady. All legally obtained, all properly anonymized. The HR rep cleared her throat. Dr. Halbridge felt personally targeted. Cassie met her eyes. Then maybe he should personally reflect. Dr. Hale raised a hand. Let's keep this constructive. We are not disciplining you. In fact, some of the committee appreciated your initiative. But we do need to clarify, were you formally reporting misconduct? Cassie leaned forward. I'm reporting a pattern. I chose the QA presentation because the formal reporting channels at Wexley are notoriously slow and protective of senior staff. I chose transparency. You asked for risk reduction. I showed you the risk. If that makes someone uncomfortable, that's not my fault. That's the truth doing its job. There was a beat of silence. Then Dr. Hale nodded slowly. Understood. There will be a follow-up review. In the meantime, continue with your regular duties. We'll be in touch. As Cassie left the room, she saw Halbridge in the hallway. He was standing beside Dr. Connors from cardiology, whispering, his face tight and pale with anger. The moment he spotted her, he stiffened, posture rigid as glass. Dorsey, he called, his tone flat. "Walk with me." She hesitated for a heartbeat, then approached. They stepped into a side corridor lined with surgical plaques, tributes to excellence, framed names etched into hospital legacy. He faced her, hands in his coat pockets. "You crossed a line." "No," she said. "You did." Repeatedly. "I don't lose," he hissed. "Not in this hospital. Not to a nurse." Cassie's smile was calm and terrible in its confidence. "Then maybe it's time you learn how to. You underestimated me. Just like you underestimate anyone who doesn't fit your profile of power. That stops now." He shook his head. "You think these people will protect you? Don't be naive. They may whisper their support, but when it matters, they'll protect the title, not the truth." Cassie stepped closer. "Then let them try. I'm not here because I'm naive. I'm here because I earned every inch of this place. And I'll expose every crack you keep pretending doesn't exist." For a second, he almost flinched. She walked away first. That evening, Jonah Patel approached her outside the hospital. His backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes earnest. "I submitted a supplementary note to the committee," he said. "About the Taylor case. They need to know I flagged it, and it got ignored." Cassie gave him a nod, moved more than she let show. "That takes guts." He shrugged. "You gave me the courage. Halbridge isn't untouchable anymore." Inside, the halls of Wexley were shifting. Not dramatically. Not yet. But a nurse's voice had risen against a doctor's silence, and for once, the institution had listened, if only for a moment. Cassie knew it wouldn't end here. Men like Halbridge didn't go quietly. But she also knew something else: he was scared now. And that was the beginning of the end. By Monday morning, Wexley Memorial felt like it had been scrubbed with bleach and panic. Department heads walked with clipped steps. Residents whispered behind closed doors. Even the elevators seemed to move more silently, as if the building itself was waiting for something to drop. Cassie arrived early, again. Not out of fear, but preparation. She wasn't just playing defense anymore, she was planning her next move. She didn't need revenge. She needed proof. The kind of proof that didn't just get someone written up, but stopped them from ever dismissing another voice again. She walked into the break room to refill her water bottle and found Dr. Felix Romaine, a middle-aged hematologist with a sharp mind and notoriously sharp tongue, standing at the counter pouring coffee. "Cassie," he said with a nod. "Heard you rattled the ivory tower last week." She gave a light smirk. "Didn't realize how hollow it was until I knocked." He chuckled. "Careful. They'll accuse you of bringing a sledgehammer." She didn't flinch. "Let them. I'll bring data next." He turned more serious. "Word is Halbridge submitted a rebuttal report. Called you overzealous and uninformed. Claimed your analysis lacked clinical context." "Of course he did," she said. "Can't fight facts, so he fights qualifications." Romaine sipped his coffee. "Funny. Some of us still remember when he nearly lost that boy in room 238, swore his vitals crash was unrelated to a failed intubation. But the nurse on that shift, Tamara, I think, filed a separate report. Quietly disappeared within the month." Cassie blinked. "That was Tamara Ortiz. She transferred to another hospital right after. Said it was personal." Romaine gave her a look that said, "We both know better. You're not wrong, Cassie. You're just brave. That scares people in power more than being wrong." Later that afternoon, Cassie received an unexpected calendar invite. Not from HR. Not from the administration. From the hospital's new quality control compliance officer, Dr. Anthony Madsen. The title alone said one thing: the board was watching now. The meeting room was small and windowless. Madsen, a bespectacled, lean man with a military-like bearing, welcomed her with polite stiffness. I'm conducting an internal audit, he said. Randomized chart reviews, response protocols, post-op outcomes. I saw your QA presentation. It raised some questions. Cassie nodded. I brought my own documentation if it helps. Charts I compiled. Notes. Dates. He raised a brow. You kept independent records? I knew I wouldn't be believed otherwise. He took the folder from her, flipping through with clinical speed. A long pause passed before he finally looked up. This is precise. Your notes are almost surgical. She didn't respond. He meant it as a compliment, but it also revealed the problem. They were shocked when a nurse's work showed rigor. I'm also looking into 2 patient complaints submitted over the past 6 months, he added. One involved a delayed response to elevated potassium levels. Sound familiar? Cassie inhaled through her nose slowly. Taylor. He nodded. The second was post-op confusion and liver distress. A family member requested their records last week. Says their mother wasn't listened to. That one, Cassie realized, was the Montgomery case. Another patient Halbridge had steamrolled through discharge, despite Cassie's flag about abnormal LFTs. What happens if these show patterns? She asked. If? Madsen said. Nurse Dorsey, they already do. The words felt heavier than expected. She wasn't crazy. It wasn't dramatic. She was right. And now someone who had the authority to act knew it too. But knowing and doing were different animals. As she left the meeting, she passed Halbridge at the end of the hallway. He was standing beside the medical director, Dr. Eileen Kravitz, their voices low but urgent. When he caught sight of her, he didn't sneer. Didn't smirk. Just stared. For the first time since she'd known him, there was no superiority in his eyes. Just a calculation. He was cornered, and he knew it. That evening, she got a text from Jonah, asterisk, they're doing surprise chart audits in the surgery wing. It's real. People are panicking. I think this is happening. Asterisk Cassie exhaled slowly as she looked out her kitchen window, the city lights blinking in rhythm. This was the part they didn't talk about, the silence between impact and consequence. The breath between a voice rising and a system answering. But for the first time in her career, she felt something new. Not pride. Not satisfied. Power. Not the kind built on titles or degrees. The kind built on truth. Earned. Proven. Unshakable. And she wasn't done yet. Cassie arrived at Wexley Memorial on Wednesday morning to a strange quiet. Not the normal, early shift hush. This was different. It was the kind of quiet that carried a pulse, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what came next. She noticed staff walking with tighter postures, glancing over their shoulders before entering break rooms, and keeping conversations short. The weight of the audit had finally settled in. The tension reached the surgical wing first. 2 compliance officers now floated between nurses' stations, asking quiet but firm questions. Cassie watched from a distance as one of them interviewed Dr. Jonah Patel outside the operating theater. She couldn't hear the words, but Jonah's expression was earnest, his hands gesturing as if trying to explain a decision chain. She didn't envy him. Residents were the easiest to pressure, but the hardest to discredit once they started speaking honestly. By 10:45 a.m., her pager buzzed with a new request, meeting requested in or conference room. Mandatory. Inside, a half-circle of chairs faced a projector screen. Seated already were Dr. Kravitz, a pair of hospital legal reps, Dr. Madsen from compliance, and, at the center of it all, Dr. Halbridge. His face was unreadable, but his presence wasn't passive. He looked like a general expecting a siege. Cassie took her seat calmly. Dr. Kravitz began. We're here to review findings from several ongoing inquiries, particularly those concerning surgical conduct, post-op documentation, and interprofessional decision-making. Halbridge shifted in his seat. I'd like to clarify that much of the so-called evidence being circulated is circumstantial at best. Decisions made in an or are nuanced. Dr. Madsen raised a hand. With respect, Dr. Halbridge, this meeting isn't to debate nuance. It's to understand how protocol was consistently bypassed. He turned to Cassie. Nurse Dorsey, could you walk us through the Montgomery file? She opened her notes. Patient, Evelyn Montgomery, 66, admitted for gallbladder removal. Labs showed elevated ALT and AST levels pre-surgery. I noted concerns regarding hepatic stress on her post-op recovery. I voiced them. Twice. They were dismissed. Dismissed how? One of the legal reps asked. Cassie didn't hesitate. Halbridge said, quote, liver numbers bounce. You nurses love to panic about numbers. That was charted in a note, cross-referenced with a time-stamped internal message. There was a quiet shuffle of papers from Madsen's side of the table. He pulled out a printed copy of that message. Dr. Kravitz turned to Halbridge. Is that your language? He glanced at the paper. That message was taken out of context. Is there a context, Cassie asked evenly, where dismissing critical lab data qualifies as best practice? Halbridge's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, he didn't have a glib retort ready. Madsen didn't wait. Further, the Taylor case indicates another failure to modify medication based on rising potassium levels. Nurse Dorsey logged a recommendation to reassess diuretic dosing. The adjustment was not made, and the patient experienced a near-fatal cardiac arrhythmia. I wasn't even primary on that patient, Halbridge said sharply. Cassie leaned forward. But you signed off on the dosing plan, overriding 2 staff concerns logged in the EMR. I brought screenshots. She handed them across the table. Every eye turned to Halbridge. He seemed smaller now, like the white coat wasn't enough to armor his stature anymore. Dr. Kravitz exhaled, clearly disturbed. We have 5 case inconsistencies linked to your decisions, and multiple staff testimonies indicating you created a culture of intimidation. The review board will take this further. Halbridge opened his mouth, then stopped. Whatever defense he had rehearsed wasn't landing in this room. Not anymore. The meeting adjourned quietly, with legal confirming that pending final board decision, Dr. Halbridge would be placed under administrative review and his surgical privileges suspended temporarily. Cassie stood last, gathering her notes slowly. As she walked past Halbridge, he looked up at her. No longer with condescension. No longer with arrogance. Just disbelief. Like a man staring at a building that had collapsed without him realizing the foundation was gone. You think you've won, he muttered. Cassie paused. This wasn't a game. But if it were, the moment you ignored people's warnings, that's when you lost. She didn't wait for a reply. Back in the East Wing, word was already spreading. Nurses exchanged wide-eyed glances. A few staff who had once avoided her now gave small nods of respect. The change wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. That afternoon, Cassie received an email, "You've been nominated to join the Interdepartmental Policy Review Task Force." It wasn't a throne. It wasn't a promotion. It was a seat at the table, the one she should have always had. And she was just getting started. Cassie returned home that evening with the weight of 20 years lifted off her shoulders. She didn't celebrate, not with wine, not with music. She sat in silence, staring at the task force email glowing on her laptop screen. It was a win, but it didn't feel like a triumph. Not yet. The damage Halbridge had caused didn't vanish just because he'd been pulled from rotation. The patients he'd silenced into pain, the voices he trained others to ignore, the trust eroded between departments, it was all still there, raw and unattended. The next morning, the hospital looked different, even though nothing had physically changed. It was in the way people moved, more careful, more deliberate. Eyes that once rolled at Cassie now looked to her with quiet expectation. Respect, yes, but also hesitation. Because when one person speaks truth to power and survives, it shakes the excuses out of everyone else. Her first stop was ICU room 304. Mr. Huntley, the patient she had gone to war over in the OR, was alert, sitting up, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as she walked in. "Nurse Cassie," he rasped, voice weak but clear. "Heard I gave you a scare." Cassie smiled warmly. "Just enough to keep me sharp." His daughter, seated beside him, rose and took Cassie's hand. "We heard what you did. The anesthesiologist told us. How you spoke up when it mattered. You saved his life." Cassie nodded, holding the woman's gaze. "That's what I'm here for. Always." Later that day, she stepped into the first session of the Interdepartmental Policy Review Task Force. The room was stark, a long table with a screen on one end and folders stacked neatly before each seat. She was the only nurse present. The others were department chairs, senior surgeons, compliance officers, and a few board-selected observers. As the meeting opened, Dr. Kravitz, now more measured and observant than ever, addressed the room. "This task force exists because systems don't fail by accident, they fail when people protect power over safety. We're here to rewire that thinking." One by one, the members introduced themselves. Some glanced at Cassie with neutral expressions. Others guarded curiosity. When her turn came, she stood. Cassandra Dorsey. Registered nurse. Critical care lead. "I'm here because protocols don't mean much if the people on the ground aren't allowed to speak. I've seen what happens when clinical knowledge is dismissed for the wrong reasons. I've lived it. I don't plan on watching it happen again." There was silence. And then, a single nod from the new compliance director. It was the first stone laid in a new foundation. But progress never walks in a straight line. At 3:17 p.m., an email pinged across the hospital network, concerns regarding recent procedural reviews. It was from Halbridge. He wasn't letting go. In the email, he formally disputed the conclusions of the audit, claimed his surgical protocols were innovative and mischaracterized, and stated that Cassie's actions had jeopardized hierarchical cohesion in emergency care. He attached a full 11-page rebuttal, citing credentials, research, and past awards. It landed like a rock thrown into a pond. Ripples of reaction shot through inboxes and conversation threads. By 5 p.m., Cassie's phone buzzed again, a second message, this time from a known figure in the surgical department, warning her that Halbridge was planning to use the press. A leak, maybe even a lawsuit. Paint her as a rogue nurse with a vendetta. She stared at her phone in the locker room. For the first time in days, fear returned. Not because she thought he could win, but because she knew how people like him survived. They didn't fight clean. They weaponized perception. Prestige. Proximity to power. But what Halbridge didn't understand, what he still hadn't learned, was that Cassandra Dorsey didn't stand alone anymore. A knock sounded at the locker room door. It was Jonah, holding a folder and looking anxious. "I don't mean to interrupt, but you should see this." Inside the folder were two fresh statements. One of the anesthesiologists was during the Huntley operation. The other was from an ER physician who had flagged Halbridge's overrides on another case. "They're backing you," Jonah said. "More people are. They just needed to know someone would stand first." Cassie took the folder, closed it, and stood. "Then it's time we stop surviving and start leading." That evening, she sent a reply to the hospital's board. A clear, sharp response to Halbridge's rebuttal. It wasn't personal. It was professional. And it was powerful. Her final line read, "You can't fix a failing system by silencing the ones who noticed the cracks. You fix it by listening. I won't be quiet again." The storm was coming. But this time, Cassandra wasn't alone in the rain. The next morning at Wexley Memorial began not with a morning huddle or patient alarm, but with headlines. Cassie walked through the main entrance and saw it on the receptionist's screen, blaring quietly under the hospital logo, renowned surgeon under review for ignoring staff warnings, internal audit sparks controversy at Wexley Memorial. By the time she reached the elevator, her phone buzzed with messages. Amina from Records had texted, *, they leaked it. It's everywhere. You okay? Another from Jonah, *, they're scrambling. Halbridge called in sick today. Rumor is that legal advised it. *, Cassie didn't smile. She didn't want this moment to feel like a victory. Because patients had been hurt. Careers derailed. Good staff silenced. The only thing she wanted now was accountability, and change that would outlive the headlines. In the nurses' station, Monica looked up with wide eyes. Girl, you're on the front page. Cassie glanced at the article. It didn't name her directly, but she was quoted as a veteran critical care nurse who raised serious procedural concerns. And Halbridge, finally, publicly, was named as the subject of a full-scale medical review. At 11:30 a.m., Cassie was summoned to an impromptu board meeting. She arrived to find a dozen people seated around a long table, legal, compliance, department chairs, and one surprising new face, Dr. Felix Romaine from hematology. He nodded to her in quiet solidarity. Dr. Kravitz opened. Nurse Dorsey, thank you for joining us. Given this morning's media release and the hospital's formal responsibility to respond, we need to clarify the facts on record. Cassie stood, composed and without hesitation. Everything I submitted to the review board was sourced from internal documentation, validated clinical guidelines, and first-hand observations. I have nothing to retract. Dr. Madsen cleared his throat. We've now had 3 additional clinicians corroborate your original statements, including a new one submitted this morning involving a case from 4 months ago. The pattern is larger than we feared. There was a murmur across the table. Dr. Romaine spoke next. At this point, I propose we move from review to disciplinary action. A suspension is no longer sufficient. What we're looking at is a systematic abuse of authority and clinical negligence. Kravitz nodded slowly, then turned to Cassie. Would you be willing to testify before the credentialing board? The room fell silent. Every eye landed on her. Cassie folded her arms. Yes. I will. The decision moved quickly. By 4 p.m., Wexley Memorial had issued a formal internal statement. Dr. Stephen Halbridge is no longer permitted to conduct procedures or supervise care pending a full board investigation. All cases under his management are being re-reviewed by an interdisciplinary panel, ***, staff erupted. Not loudly, not out in the open. But in break rooms and stairwells, there were whispers of disbelief, ***, it happened. ***, more nurses stepped forward. Even physicians who had previously kept their heads down started to admit what they'd seen. Halbridge hadn't just ignored Cassie, he'd dismissed dozens of staff across departments. Nurses, techs, and even a few junior doctors who never dared speak against him. That evening, as Cassie exited the hospital, she paused by the glass wall outside the surgical wing, the one with framed photos of distinguished contributors. Halbridge's photo was still there, silver plaque shining under the fluorescent lights. Monica approached quietly. You think they'll take it down? Cassie looked at the photo. Eventually. Maybe not today. But they will. You don't erase harm with silence. She turned to leave, but paused. Actually. She walked over to the janitor's closet nearby, borrowed a roll of white medical tape, and walked back. With one clean motion, she covered the plaque with a single strip. On it, she wrote in Sharpie, pending review. Monica gasped. Girl, you bold. Cassie just smiled. Not bold. Just done being quiet. The next morning, the tape was still there. Someone had drawn a small check mark next to her writing. Someone else had written beneath it, *, we see you. *, what had begun as a confrontation had grown into a reckoning. A whole building, once silent, was finally beginning to echo the voices it had long ignored. But for Cassie, the work wasn't over. Next week was her first task force session on policy restructuring. The agenda? Power dynamics and patient safety. Halbridge had made his name through silence and status. Cassie was building hers with truth. The boardroom wasn't new, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just a meeting room anymore, it was the front line. The second session of the Interdepartmental Policy Review Task Force had begun, and unlike the first meeting, the air now carried a weight of expectation. The usual suspects sat around the table: Dr. Kravitz, Madsen, Felix Romaine, the board liaison from legal. And at the far end, one new addition, nurse supervisor Amanda King from pediatrics. Black, mid-50s, and sharp as a scalpel. Cassie had worked with her once years ago during a flu outbreak, and she remembered Amanda as someone who could calm a panicked parent with just a glance. They exchanged a subtle nod across the room. One more ally in a place where allies had always been few. Dr. Kravitz opened the floor. Today's agenda: staff feedback mechanisms and power protocol. We'll be reviewing how decisions are made in emergency care environments, and more importantly, how they're challenged. Cassie tapped her pen on her pad. This was her moment. She stood. We keep pretending that hospital hierarchy is a safety net, but in practice, it's become a wall. The truth is, many of us have witnessed preventable errors, not because the knowledge wasn't there, but because those who had it were ignored. The room was still. Doctors are trained to lead. Nurses are trained to observe. But in reality, we both see. The difference is who's allowed to act on what they see. We need a model where speaking up is not seen as insubordination, but as clinical responsibility. Amanda King chimed in, her voice like warm steel. It's not just about being allowed to speak up. It's about being protected when you do. We've lost too many good staff because they were made to feel disposable for challenging the wrong person. Romaine added, even among doctors, junior staff feel the same suppression. It's not limited to nurses. It's about arrogance hiding behind authority. Dr. Madsen nodded, scribbling something. So what do we recommend structurally? Cassie didn't hesitate. Mandatory team debriefs after high-risk procedures. Anonymous escalation channels directly to compliance. Cross-disciplinary review boards for every flagged critical case, not just physicians. She paused. And ongoing equity training. Not just about race, but about listening. Because we know bias doesn't always come in slurs. Sometimes it comes in silence. No one argued. The next day, her proposed framework was distributed across department heads for feedback. The document was titled, Equitable Clinical Accountability, a Multi-Voice Model for Safer Care. Underneath the title was a simple note, drafted by Cassandra Dorsey, RN, CCRN, MSN. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. A nurse's name, on a policy draft, meant to reshape how decisions were made. That had never happened before at Wexley Memorial. But while reform brewed in the administrative wings, something else was unraveling behind closed doors. Halbridge had gone dark for 5 days. No messages. No appearances. But on Friday afternoon, an internal memo landed in Cassie's inbox, subject, confidential notification, voluntary resignation notice from, Office of Medical Administration to, Surgical and Critical Care Staff ** effective immediately, Dr. Stephen Halbridge has submitted his formal resignation and will no longer hold clinical or administrative duties at Wexley Memorial Hospital. A transition plan is in place, and further updates will be provided. Please direct patient-specific questions to department leadership. There was no fanfare. No ceremony. Just a clean email, designed to be forgotten. But it wasn't. Cassie printed the email and pinned it quietly to the bulletin board in the nurses' lounge. She didn't highlight it. She didn't circle his name. She didn't need to. The message was loud enough in its stillness. He's gone. Monica walked in 10 minutes later, stopped in her tracks, and whispered, I didn't think they'd let him go. Cassie responded without looking up from her chart. They didn't. He left. Men like him always prefer to disappear rather than to be held accountable. Jonah passed her in the hallway later that day, relief written across his face. You were right. We just needed one person to push. One. Cassie smiled. Now you be that one for someone else. Her shift ended quietly. No applause. No ceremony. Just patients being cared for, machines beeping, families waiting. But under all that noise, a foundation had shifted. And Cassie could feel it. Later that night, she stood outside the hospital in the soft summer air, watching the lights in the upper floors flicker like stars in a restless sky. Amanda King stepped out and joined her, arms crossed. They'll name a wing after you if you keep this up. Cassie laughed. I don't need a wing. I just need them to listen. Amanda looked at her, solemn and proud. They're listening now. And just like that, after a career spent shouting into silence, Cassandra Dorsey realized something: the system hadn't changed her. She had changed it. Brick by brick. Word by word. 2 months later, Wexley Memorial didn't look different on the surface. The walls were still white and sterile. The same chime signaled the end of visiting hours. The coffee in the break room was still bad. But beneath that unchanged exterior, something fundamental had shifted. A new protocol had gone into effect, the Dorsey Review Mandate, unofficially named, of course, but everyone knew what it was. It required every high-risk procedure to undergo a mandatory multidisciplinary debrief within 24 hours. Nurses, residents, surgical assistants, everyone got a seat at the table. It was the first policy in hospital history written with input not just from physicians, but from the nursing staff itself. And Cassandra Dorsey's name was on the draft that built it. She didn't boast. That wasn't her way. Instead, she worked her usual shift in the East Wing, checking charts, drawing meds, adjusting ventilator settings, and advocating for her patients like she always had. But the difference now? People listened. Not just out of fear. Out of respect. Monica now led the shift briefings. Jonah had been chosen to present at the state residency conference, citing interdisciplinary courage under pressure. Amina had been promoted in records. Even Trina, who once shrank from confrontation, now pushed back on attending physicians when care plans ignored nursing assessments. Cassie didn't spark a moment. She had sparked a movement. That morning, Dr. Felix Romaine met her outside or for. You've seen the new credentialing revisions? Cassie nodded. Saw the draft. Finally, requiring emotional intelligence training for supervisors. Romaine chuckled. It only took 3 patient near misses, an internal investigation, and 1 unshakable nurse. She smiled. Better late than never. Then came something she never expected. A letter. Not in her inbox, but on real paper, slid into her locker in a plain envelope. Inside, Cassandra, I won't pretend I understand everything now, or that I deserve forgiveness. But I see the damage I caused. You were right to challenge me. I thought being brilliant meant being above reproach. But true brilliance listens. I never did, I'll carry the consequences, but I want you to know, watching you hold your ground without ever raising your voice did something to me. It taught me what I should have learned long ago, Stephen Halbridge She stared at the letter for a long time. Not because she wanted vindication from him. She had already earned that through action. But because his words proved something deeper, the system didn't just hear her, it was beginning to change because of her. Weeks later, at the hospital's annual Quality and Safety Conference, Cassie was asked to give the closing keynote. She stepped onto the stage wearing her navy scrubs, no blazer, no title-tagged lanyard, just her name badge and the confidence of a woman who had stood in fire and refused to burn. She began, when I started at Wexley Memorial, I thought I just needed to be good. Skilled. Focused. Composed. I thought that would be enough. It wasn't. For people like me, black women in white institutions, good is never enough. We have to be unshakable, and sometimes, even that won't save us from being overlooked, dismissed, or mocked. But here's the thing, I didn't come here to be liked. I came here to be heard. She scanned the room, faces rapt, heads nodding. I was told to stay in my lane, to defer to the experts. But when lives are on the line, silence is complicity. Expertise doesn't come from title alone. It comes from experience. From watching. From listening. And when the system tried to make me invisible, I did the one thing it couldn't ignore, I spoke. The audience stood before she even finished. Not for applause. For acknowledgement. For a nurse who had forced an institution to reckon with itself. That night, she walked out of the hospital and sat alone on the bench near the emergency bay. It was late. The stars were few, but bright. A new resident she hadn't met before approached, hesitant. A young black woman with shaking hands and tired eyes. "Are you Nurse Dorsey?" Cassie nodded. "I just started my residency," the woman said softly. "They told us about you on the first day. Told us you changed how things work around here." Cassie smiled, slowly and quietly. "I didn't change everything. Just lit the first match." The resident sat beside her, and for a moment, they just listened to the sound of ambulance wheels in the distance. A legacy wasn't made by loud speeches or plaques on walls. It was made in these moments, one person passing the torch to another. And for the first time in a long time, Cassandra Dorsey didn't feel alone in the fight. She had sparked something that wouldn't go out. Not anymore. Dear friend, every voice in a workplace matters, no matter their title, background, or skin color. Sometimes, the people closest to the problem hold the clearest solutions. Cassandra's story is a reminder that courage, knowledge, and compassion can challenge even the most powerful systems. If this story moved you, opened your eyes, or made you think, don't stay silent. Hit that like button, share this video, and most importantly, subscribe to this channel for more stories that empower, expose, and inspire. Because real change starts when the truth is heard, and you're part of that movement.